And thank you, Gary, for putting me in the food coma slot this afternoon.
No, right after lunch it's the worst.
So I will try to be entertaining as well as informative. And what this is about is it turns out that the San Antonio office. Just get you to the next slide. Okay. Push that down. Got it. Okay. So it turns out that the San Antonio office of the FBI was investigating Alpha 66 in 1963, long before the Kennedy assassination. And so these documents, of course, by themselves are not earth-shattering, but there's a lot of, the way it often works out, it's only when they're seen in context that they seem to actually reveal more than what they actually say. If that makes any sense. Okay, so as John was saying, Alpha 66 was trying to blow up, shooting at these freighters, often ineffectually, and this, in spite of, I think this was an instance where they shot off a Russian freighter called, I think it was called the Lvov. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. Antonio Vesiana called up the newspapers, got it reported, and as probably, as we say, is trying to cause an international incident, upset Kennedy's hands-off approach to Cuba, which resulted in Kennedy putting out 2 orders, one of which was to order the Coast Guard to cut off any further excursions out of Miami towards Cuba, and the other was an order to the FBI to investigate Alpha 66 for violation of the Neutrality Act. And so it was that the FBI office in San Antonio got involved. In late April 63, the tipster had told them that a Cuban man down in South Texas, down in Brownsville, could have some information about Alpha 66. Now, in case you didn't know, a little background, there is a Cuban community in South Texas along the river there. And I'm not talking Cuban Americans, these are Cuban exiles. Most notable being the former president of Cuba, Carlos Prio, who had set up his headquarters there at the luxury hotel, the Las Palmas. Still there. I was at a conference there last week. He had absconded with millions from the Treasury when he was deposed by Batista. And so it was that in 1958, this clean-shaven young lawyer crossed the river and met with him at the Las Palmas and told him for $1 million he would overthrow Batista and return him to power. And so Prio, not trusting him, just gave him $50,000, but that was enough to buy a yacht called the Grandma, and just didn't include enough for razor blades, but the rest, as they say, is history. So the informant told him that this man, a Cuban man named Miguel Perez, ran a restaurant on Elizabeth Street in Brownsville, Texas. So the FBI sent an agent there and interviewed him, and Perez told him that a man had come into the restaurant and that he was looking to hire a good-looking young Cuban woman who would be willing to travel on behalf of Alpha 66. Now, there's lots of reasons why I can think why a attractive young woman would be useful on a trip, but in this case we actually have some context and background because there was such a young woman, Rita Lawrence, girlfriend of Alpha 66 member Frank Sturgis of Watergate fame. She tells us in her book that one of the things Alpha 66 was doing was smuggling weapons into Cuba in support of counter-revolutionaries there, and that after Kennedy had cut them off, they found that a ready source of weapons was these National Guard armories, which are typically in sleepy little towns. Late at night, there's only one guy, young soldier, on guard, so she would go up and wee hours in the morning and knock on the door and say, kind sir, I've got a flat tire, or my car won't start. And he would, when he stepped out, her comrades lurking with her would jump the guy, tie him up, and then help themselves to the weapons. And in her book she swears they never hurt any of these boys, they just, tied him up. and took the weapons. So the following month, after, having heard this, they asked, who was this guy? And he said he had left a calling card, and his name, let's see, his name was Raymond B. Welch. He was the owner of the South Texas Moving Van and Storage Company in McAllen, Texas. So the following month, they called up the credit bureau and found out that he had no credit problems, but he had previously lived in San Angelo, Texas. So then in July '63, they sent an agent to San Angelo to investigate him. They found out that his family still owned a moving van and storage company in San Angelo, but that he had divorced his wife, left town. And at this point, I'm thinking, why were these documents held secret for 40 years? I mean, who cares who divorced who? Surely calling up the credit bureau was not a method that had to be covered up. And these reports are occurring at monthly interviews. They're very cursory reports, as if it's a task that somebody has to report on what they found out about Alpha 66. And it probably has something to do with what was happening that summer. Over $1 million worth of weapons had disappeared from Fort Hood. And so the FBI was called in to investigate, and their suspicions fell on this character, flamboyant guy, George Nante, who was the ordnance officer. So he was the one guy who should have noticed that there were weapons missing, claimed that he knew nothing. So they put a tail on him, and then some months later, that fall, he went to Dallas and met with Alpha 66 people and with the owner of Mason's Gun Shop, John Thomas Mason. So those of you who are steep with the lore, and I know nobody is more steep in the lore than the people in this room, John Thomas Mason was ostensibly investigated because his gun shop was the one source of Mannlicher Carcano ammunition in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. And so he was interviewed to see if he could remember having sold ammunition to Lee Harvey Oswald. But remember, this FBI report went on for page after page, and it was his whole life history. So why were they so interested in John Thomas Mason?
Well, he ran with the Minutemen.
Yeah, he was a Minuteman.
And he
he
looked
had
a
a
little bit like
resemblance to
LH.
Oswald.
He looked a little bit like Oswald, say some people.
Right.
A lot.
So,
Don, why don't you explain who Orcabero is?
Yeah.
okay, well, I'm going to get to that. He was the leader of Alpha 66 in Dallas, and I will circle back.
No worries.
I will
No
circle
worries.
back to that. Okay, so the FBI got a tip that there was going to be an exchange of weapons on a dark street in Dallas, and we know this not because the FBI tells us about it, but because the FBI called in the Dallas police. And so because the JFK Records Act, the city of Dallas opened its files. And that's how researchers, especially the LaFontaines, who got at those files and found out what was going on. So there was a tip that there were going to be exchange of weapons on a street corner late at night in Dallas, and so the police were called in to help them stake out the place. And sure enough, around midnight, John Thomas Mason in his '57 Chevy Bel Air Chevrolet. Can you believe this is the only photograph of a '57 Chevy Bel Air that I could find on the internet?
Are you serious?
I certainly would not want to imply anything.
Well, that's the way it appears in the report.
Right. And so then up came this dark blue Ford Thunderbird, and then they witnessed as Mason opened up the trunk and took out 4 military machine guns and passed them on to the guys in the blue Thunderbird, at which point now the police moved in to make their arrest, only to have the guys in the blue Thunderbird take off. There's a chase, and which ends when they pile up the Thunderbird into a telephone pole, severely injuring the guys in the car. So the 2 men in the blue Thunderbird, Lawrence Miller and a guy named Donnell Witter, were arrested. But this gets back to a story that the LaFontaines discovered that a hobo named John Elrod had been arrested for vagrancy in March of 1964 and proceeded to tell this wild tale to the deputy sheriffs there in Memphis about he being arrested on the day of the Kennedy assassination. He was hiding in the railroad yard and being taken into custody and spending the weekend in a jail cell next to Lee Harvey Oswald. And he said that Saturday they brought in a man who was all wrapped in bandages, who had been injured in a car chase with the police, and that Oswald was asked if he knew the man. And Oswald had said that yes, he had been in a meeting with this and other men a couple of weeks earlier. Now this incident that I just described happened just a week before the assassination in November. And Oswald then named the other men at the meeting, and the one name that stood out that Elrod remembered was the name of Jack Ruby. And this was at the time when Jack Ruby was on trial and insisting that he had never met Oswald. Another thing and so the happened to be a crime reporter present, and he published this story in the Memphis newspaper. The FBI then demanded a retraction, saying they had checked the records and that Elrod had not been arrested in Dallas in 1963. But then the police records were opened up because JFK Records Act and LaFontaine found, in fact, that John Elrod was one of the hobos that was arrested in the, so we know who the liars are. Another thing about Don L. Witter was that he was an auto mechanic who worked at the Texaco station on Jefferson Boulevard, which we recall that's where Lee Harvey Oswald's jacket, Eisenhower jacket, was found. Could be coincidence. Well, this relates to a story, a tip that the Dallas police got from a woman who claimed that she was having breakfast at a restaurant in Oak Cliff and overheard a conversation of men in the booth next to her who were saying that Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby were good buddies, such that when Ruby's car was being repaired, it was Lee Harvey Oswald who went and picked it up for him when it was ready. And so the police asked, "Hey Jack, where do you have your car repaired?" Well, he says at the Texaco station on Jefferson Boulevard. So there's a hint of a suggestion that maybe these characters knew each other. Now, back to these guys. Manuel Rodriguez Orcabero was the leader of Alpha 66 in Dallas. He was convicted and with the violation of the Federal Firearms Act because of this incident, deported to Puerto Rico. He admitted in his interview that he was the leader of Alpha 66 in Dallas and that they would hold regular meetings at the home of Jorge Salazar on Hollandale Street, which, by the way, is just on the other side of the freeway from Jack Ruby's apartment. And that relates back to information that Deputy Sheriff Alan Sweat had told the Secret Service that Lee Harvey Oswald was an informant for the FBI and that he had been attending Cuba Libre meetings at a house on Hollandale, which leads us to ask, I wonder who the informant was that gave them that good information that led to the arrest on that dark street corner that night.
It was his mother.
That's right, yeah. And John Thomas Mason, yes, he turns out he was a member of the Minutemen, one of the reasons they were investigating him, who, by the way, the leader of that group in Dallas was General Edwin Walker. Walker admitted in his testimony that he had attended one of the meetings on Hollandale Street with the Cuban group. There's another detail in that interview from the FBI that I wanted to mention. He related that at one point he had traveled to Guadalajara, Mexico in order to acquire British Enfield rifles.
Who had Mason?
John Thomas Mason.
Mason.
Which relates to this story by this lady. Nancy Perrin Rich, widely criticized by folks on both sides. She testified to the Warren Commission that Jack Ruby was involved in a smuggling gang, running guns into Cuba. So her story was that on 2 occasions she had attended a meeting in Dallas at an apartment building with a boyfriend who she said he was involved in this gun running. He was going to be on the boat that took the guns from Miami into Cuba. So she said at this meeting, there were other Cuban men. There was another woman who she described as a granite-faced woman. And she said the person in charge of the operation was an American Army colonel. And they asked her, well, how do you know he was an Army colonel? And she said, well, he was wearing his uniform at this meeting. And then she said at one point, there was a glitch, and she said the plan was to go to Guadalajara, Mexico to acquire British Army rifles.
Wow.
So if we ask the question, so is this the same gun running ring? Or is she just making things up? It seems like a heck of a coincidence that there was a plot in which they were going to Guadalajara, Mexico to get weapons. And there was an American Army colonel named Robert Castor who was hanging out, according to this witness, along with General Walker, giving speeches to the local Cuban exiles and getting them all fired up against President Kennedy. And she said that at one point there was a knock on the door, Jack Ruby walked in, that Ruby went into the back room with the colonel, and later he came out and left, and everybody's all smiles, and the colonel says, okay, you guys can go to Guadalajara now to get the money. And so she said she assumes that Ruby must have brought the money to pay for the weapons. And so the Warren Commission asked her, well, where do you think he got the money? That's a leading question. And she said she didn't know, but she knew someone who did. She said, you need to talk to a guy named Eddie Bronner, because he knows a lot more about it than I do. He's supposed to go on the boat to Cuba with my boyfriend. So the Warren Commission told the FBI, okay, we need you guys to find this guy, Eddie Bronner, and while you're at it, talk to a woman named Bertha Cheek, because she might fit that, the Bert Griffin was the one that suspected that it was probably Bertha Cheek who would fit that description. Well, it turns out, of course, the FBI already knew all about Eddie Browder, Donald Edward Browder, who, through an informant, they had learned that he and Jack Ruby were smuggling weapons into Cuba, that they were co-owners of an airplane for that purpose. It was only later that the House Select Committee actually located Browder and interviewed him, who told them the same story, but added that it was okay because it was a CIA operation.
I love Carlos Frio too. Carlos Frio.
And as for the granite-faced woman, now I'm not sure if that woman, I've not been able to find a picture of Bertha Cheek. But it's just this is a lady. Of course, that's Earlene Roberts, her sister, Lee Harvey Oswald's housekeeper. And this relates to the testimony. This is when the FBI interviewed her. She claimed she wasn't a business partner of Jack Ruby's, and she knew nothing about gun running. But the FBI got another tip, and they were told that, you may have seen this in the Warren Commission exhibits, it's just a postcard, and it says you need to talk to the owner of a laundromat in Oak Cliff because he has information about Lee Harvey Oswald. And so the FBI canvassed, not just because of the card, but because they were trying to track that Eisenhower jacket to Oswald. It had a laundry mark on it. So they were canvassing the different laundries. So they talked to this laundromat owner, his name was Waldron Litchfield, and he told them that he was negotiating with a partner with Jack Ruby to buy Jack Ruby's Carousel Club. And that when he got to the Carousel Club, he saw Lee Harvey Oswald there with Jack Ruby, and they appeared to be good buddies. And so the FBI asked him, so who was your business partner in this deal? And he said, well, it's Bertha Cheek. Now the weapons, those 4 machine guns that were stolen, that they witnessed passing, being exchanged on that dark street corner, originated at the National Guard Armory in Terrell, Texas. And it turns out that they had been brought in from Fort Hood only the day before. So it appears that they had perhaps changed their MO because they knew that the FBI was onto them. And that relates to the story that, when Jack Ruby was arrested for killing Lee Harvey Oswald, he said to the police, "Hey guys, would you let my little dog Sheba out of the car? I left my dog in the car." And this is a story that the Warren Commission uses to say that this is evidence that Jack Ruby's murder was not premeditated, because he never would have brought his little dog if he was planning to kill Oswald. Of course, you could just turn that around and say, knowing that he would never see his beloved dog again. So BS. But then the cops then asked Ruby, "Okay, give us the keys to your car," and he said, "Oh, well, I locked them in the trunk."
Yeah, that's
So much for not premeditated. So when they pried open the trunk of the car, they found 4 money orders made out $200 each to a man named Samuel Baker. So this man, he had cashed these 4 money orders for Samuel Baker, who happens to be the ordnance officer at the National Guard Armory in Terrell, Texas.
Oh, wow.
4 machine guns, 4 money orders.
Were they Western Union money?
So they interviewed Baker, and they asked him, so how'd you happen to have $800 in cash? And he said that was his bonus for re-upping, and that he had changed them into money orders because it was too much money to carry around safely, and then he cashed them all at a strip joint. And they asked him, how'd you happen to be in Jack Ruby's nightclub? And he said he went there to celebrate his re-uppance. And they asked him who was there to celebrate with him, and he said, well, it was his lady friend, Bertha Cheek.
Oh, so guess what?
Along that same story, Jack Ruby said that he was downtown because he needed to send a wire to Little Lynn Carlin so that she could afford to come appear in his nightclub. She was in Oklahoma City at the time. So the Oklahoma City FBI interviewed Carlin to find out if this was a true story, and Little Lynn told them that not only was Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald good friends, but that they were homosexual lovers. Now we know that Ruby was homosexual. So apparently, well, perhaps, well, yeah, including his boyfriend that he lived with.
Yeah.
But
Garrison thought he was a bisexual.
perhaps he was bisexual. And along that point, Little Lynn told the FBI the name of the bartender at the gay bar they like to hang out with. In terms of being homosexual, bisexual, she told him Ruby was the pitcher and Oswald was the catcher.
Oh.
Which may be too much detail. But they
Can you
said,
put a picture of that?
so she told them that the name of the bartender of the gay bar that they like to hang out with in case they wanted more detail, which of course is the last thing that they wanted.
What was the name of the bar? Do you know?
It's in her testimony.
Okay.
And the name of the bartender. Okay, but I digress. Back to my story. In August of 1963 then, or July 63? Okay, July 63, again they called up the Credit Bureau in McAllen and found out that Raymond Welch had left town and had moved to Corpus Christi. So the following month, in August, they called the Better Business Bureau in Corpus Christi. They found out that Mr. Welch had rented a warehouse on the docks in Corpus, and that he had also put a down payment on a house. And that relates to a statement that a rival of Jack Ruby's had told the FBI that Ruby was running guns to Cuba and that he was keeping them on a house over on the coast. Same house. And it also relates to this man, Thomas Eli Davis. An FBI document says that Thomas Eli Davis, a member of Alpha 66, was running guns from the coast of Texas over to Cuba using a surplus gunboat. So the guy with the warehouse over there, members of Alpha 66. And of course, Thomas Eli Davis enters the picture because Jack Ruby's lawyer tells us that when he was preparing Ruby's defense, the issue wasn't, of course, did he actually kill Lee Harvey Oswald? Only about 1 million people saw that. The issue was predetermination. And so the concern was, did Ruby and Oswald know each other? And so Ruby was going to claim, and did, that he had never met him. And so his lawyer asked him, is there anyone who the prosecution could call as a witness who might contradict your assertion? And Ruby said, Davis. And that's why when the Warren Commission interviewed Jack Ruby, they asked him, so who is this guy, Tommy Davis? And Ruby had said it was a guy that he was involved with trying to sell guns, Jeeps. He was going to sell Jeeps to Cuba, of course, with really weapons.
So Don, you're saying the Warren Commission knew about Davis?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, well, let
Yeah.
me finish. He knew about Davis?
They
But
asked him that
did they
question.
ever interview him?
He was dead
Oh, okay.
at the time.
Did he die in the Congo?
Algeria.
Yeah.
Algeria?
Algeria.
Okay.
Wait a minute. Wasn't that the story with QJ Wynn getting him out?
Yeah, there
Yes.
was that.
And then
They
he
were trying to
died?
get him out. Yeah.
And then he
QJ
died?
Wynn was associated with Davis, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Talk about a hot
Just a
lead.
coincidence, though.
Yeah.
Talk
just
about a hot
coincidence.
lead.
Just a
Okay.
Christ.
Okay. So in October 63, in September 63, where was it? Okay, October 63, once again, calling the Better Business Bureau, the Credit Bureau, and they're telling him that now Mr. Welch has left town and he has moved to Dallas 1 month before the assassination. So it appears that's when the Alpha 66 gun running ring was picked up, moved into Dallas, and that's when they got busted on that dark street corner that night. And then the spaghetti hits the fan on November 22nd. And now, the San Antonio FBI, who's on this cursory investigation, what they thought they were investigating Alpha 66, now suddenly realized they've actually been investigating the Kennedy assassination. They just didn't know it. And so now, instead of just calling the Better Business Bureau, the first thing they do is they have to request to their mother office in Houston. They wanted Raymond Welch's military records, and they specifically asked if he had a sniper training. Now, it could be just a CYA kind of a thing, but they actually went back to Brownsville and they re-interviewed the restaurant owner. Again, what can you tell us about this guy Raymond Welch? And they said, I told you what I know, but there's a man in McAllen who's connected with the Cuban community, and he may be able to tell you a lot more than I did. And so they went to McAllen. His name was Cristobal Casanova, which name I recognize. Such an odd name. He's actually a known character in South Texas. He's the go-to guy, sort of like the godfather of the Cuban community down there. It's one that the newspapers would go to whenever there was something going on with Cuba, and they would interview him. So the FBI interviewed him, asked him if he knew who Raymond Welch, and never heard of him. How about Alpha 66? Never heard of him.
Bullshit.
So he clammed up. But the FBI in San Antonio continued. For the next 6 months, they continued to dog this guy. And wanting to know, they're calling, checking with different police departments and trying to find out, interviewing different organizations, trying to get any information they could before they finally gave up. So I don't mean to be too anticlimactic. So I'm not saying he was the guy on the grassy knoll or anything. But it ties back to what Griffin and Hubert had said when they were relieved of their authority, when they were told to stop investigating, that we think that Ruby and Oswald were involved in illegal activities with the Cubans, and we just have not been able to focus on that area.
So you're saying Griffin did know about Tommy Davis?
Yes.
Is that why he wrote that memo? Do you think so?
He knew that these Cuban things were going on. It turns out that although the FBI did not tell them, Frank Ellsworth, who was the ATF agent on the case, he briefed them.
Is that how Griffin knew?
I assume that's how Griffin knew. He said he's
Also
not
writing
the
a
Warren
book
Commission.
now, Griffin.
Is he?
Griffin.
Good. Okay.
You know any more about Ellsworth? Didn't Ellsworth wonder why it was that the Dallas police ran that operation that night? He was investigating that same gun running thing.
Right.
And I think that cut it short. At least that's my reading.
That's what happened in Tennessee.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Do you know that Ellsworth was one of the people who discovered the gun nest on the 6th floor?
I think I remember it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
He said the fourth
I think
floor.
I told him to read him about that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Has anyone, have you tried to look into Senator Dodd's papers at all?
Interesting.
Because he's, I mean, one theory is that Oswald was investigating on behalf of that committee.
Yeah.
And Dodd's papers are in a college right now.
I could just add, because I do work on the rifle, the entire week after they took the rifle, Dodd was complaining to the FBI about, or rather, Waldman, the vice president of Klein, was complaining about all of the Dodd committee aggravation he was getting all that next week. It's quite interesting.
Because Klein's one of the operations they were investigating.
Yeah,
Mine
mail
was-
mail order
As well as the
sales.
one where the pistol
Yeah,
came
Seymour
from.
was as well.
Their statistics show for the
You done?
month that they
That was
the month that Oswald was